US President Donald Trump has announced plans to withdraw American troops from Germany, citing frustration with what he sees as Europe's lack of support for American operations over Iran and with the state of European allies' defense spending. Trump has also threatened similar military drawdowns in Italy and Spain and has repeatedly raised the possibility of withdrawing US troops from NATO as well. These moves have placed the 77-year-old military alliance under great strain and deepened the growing divide between the US and its European friends. Take a look.
But I think there's a broad recognition that there are going to be eventually less US troops in Europe than there has historically been, for a variety of reasons. In fact, there was a surge after for example, the movement of troops from Germany that was announced a week ago. The Germans didn't freak out about it because they knew it just took us back to the 2022 numbers. And it was, I think, a reduction of less than 11 or 12% of our total presence there.
So is it posturing or policy, or is this merely a Trump administration trying to pressure Europe into stepping up support for America in Iran? Or is it more like a natural extension of Trump's more selective vision of America's global engagement? And also, in light of all these, how are European countries stepping up and working together under this background of seemingly less predictable American support? And for those of us in the Indo-Pacific, how is Europe exploring and expanding cooperation with us in our part of the world, in both security, economic, and in so many other ways as well? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Wen Song. To unpack these issues and more, I'm joined by Marcin Jerzewski, head of European Value Center's Taiwan office, and Simona Fentova, China analyst at Project Synopsis. Simona, Marcin, thank you both for coming onto the show.
Thanks for having me.
So Trump recently ordered a withdrawal of US troops from Germany after German Chancellor Friedrich Merz publicly criticized the US military operation against Iran as, quote, lacking a clear strategy, unquote. At the same time, Trump cited his personal rapport with Polish President Karol Nawrocki and authorized the increase of American military presence in Poland. Take a look.
Italy has not been of any help to us, and Spain has been horrible, absolutely horrible. You know, it's NATO. It's not even the fact that they're bad. It's one thing if they said nicely, or if they said, okay, we'll help, but the help's a little slow.
So Marcin, I'll start with you. All these new announcements from Trump in terms of military adjustment in Europe, is it a case of Trump throwing some tantrum over Iran, or is it part of a bigger, longer-term strategy shift on the US side?
Look, one of the clearest signs that this is more of a personalistic decision rather than a coherent strategy being developed in Washington comes from within Washington itself. We can consider that both the House and Senate Armed Services Committees on a bipartisan basis have criticized this decision to withdraw US troops from Germany. And if we look at the numbers, the number of 5,000 may at the end of the day seem more symbolic because it is roughly 1/7 of the 38,000 troops which are already stationed in Germany. But it is sending a very pronounced signal about Trump's aspirations to exert more control over defense policy planning in European capitals. He is sending the message that simply says, you're not doing enough. And I'm saying that you're not doing enough instead of you're not doing anything, because Germany has actually sent signs in the direction of Washington that it is willing to make a valuable contribution to upholding transatlantic relations, also in security and defense. Germany has already pledged to send a minesweeper to the Strait of Hormuz once the US and Iran reach a meaningful ceasefire. Then Elbridge Colby himself within the Department of War has also praised Germany's decision to publish its military strategy for the first time since the end of the Second World War. So personalistic factors shine more brightly than others.
All right, so that's a more optimistic take, I think. Germany's doing something more than before. There's some positive feedback from the US side, and even within the US, not quite clear-cut consensus across executive and legislative as well. How about you, Simona? What's your take? Are you slightly more optimistic or a bit more pessimistic on this?
There is maybe a problem on how do we understand the purpose of NATO alliance, because as we see now, Trump has a feeling that there is a certain obligation to help him in his war against Iran. But NATO is about defense, and what Trump has done to Iran is definitely not a case of defense, because that was an attack.
Actually, I do have a question on this, if I may, Simona, because Trump is doing more than just, I guess, decreasing troops in some European countries. Like there's both carrot and stick, it seems like. So Trump is decreasing troops in Germany, but in the same time, he's also talking about increasing 5,000 more troops to Poland as well. And in doing so, he also cited his personal relationship with Polish President Karol Nawrocki. So both carrot and stick. To what extent do you feel this might represent a new kind of divide and conquer, sort of a reward people you like and maybe punish actor you don't like quite as much kind of approach from Trump's side?
I think this is a very important take. We see that lots of the policies happening now, or lots of those are personal interests driven, and I think it would be more useful to think about nation's interest and not about one person's feelings, because I would also say that. I would also like to stress out that the troops positioned within European Union's countries or other European allies within NATO alliance, they are not there just to defend Europe, but those are frequently used to engage in other parts of the world. They are very important when it comes to logistics and the Middle East. So I would say that if Trump would like to gain something in Middle East, including Iran, there's no point at decreasing his power within Europe.
All right, and marching on that note, though, in terms of how personalistic this foreign policy retooling, if you will, seems to be, to what extent do you feel that reflect a different conception of the utility or meaning of alliances to the Trump administration today, and how do you think they look at the value of long-standing alliances now?
Already during the first Trump administration, we have seen signs that Trump himself was not really appreciative of what he viewed as Europe being a free rider in terms of lower defense spending as an expression of a percentage of GDP than the United States. However, if we want to understand why the tensions in transatlantic relations are more pronounced during the current administration, I believe that we should look at ideological factors. Because on top of this very business-centric mindset that Trump continues to exhibit, he is surrounded with individuals like his Vice President J.D. Vance, who are criticizing Europe for being a liberal bulwark, being an adversary in the ongoing culture war. And as we know, during the most recent elections to the Bundestag in Germany, we saw signs from Washington that they were highly supportive of the far-right party AfD rather than this more traditional political establishment that Friedrich Merz himself represents. So we can consider a number of additional variables, for example, the broader context of tariffs that are also creating tension in transatlantic relations. But for me, what really marks a difference between the first and the second Trump administration is precisely this ideological component of cultural war that the US seeks to wage globally.
All right, that's a great point there. So this going beyond, I guess, interest-based argument isn't about burden sharing among allies, how to make it more equitable, blah, 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 but it's ideology factor as well in terms of being more of a inward-looking isolation of America, perhaps? Or
Here, I would just like to very briefly emphasize that
Yes.
Poland has very clearly said that it will not commit its personnel to an intervention in Iran. Poland did not send its assets to the Strait of Hormuz, saying very clearly that it needs to take care of its neighborhood first. And I believe that Washington recognizes very clearly Poland's unwavering support for Ukraine. And even though Poland is not committing to the offensive war that the US has started, it still falls in line with this idea of Europe taking care of itself.
Okay, that's interesting. So in spite of that personal level, good feeling between Polish leader and Trump, there is a line of stand that Poland still draws in terms of not engaging in offensive operation itself. It sounds like. So how about you, Simona? What's your take on this whole issue about, I guess, Trump administration's foreign policy philosophy and the meaning of America first today, especially when it comes to Europe-US relations?
The first thing I have noticed is that for many decades, basically since the Second World War, America or the USA was like the world's biggest hegemon, and they would be able to maintain their presence all around the globe. And what I see now is like a striking change in this approach, because we see that they are engaging less and less in different parts of the world. And I just do not get like, why do they do it? Because it feels to me that they had this unique position of being the world's biggest superpower, and they are suddenly taking themselves from, like, they are suddenly stopping to engage with their partners and allies in many different places, just to have a feeling that they should maintain a smaller sphere of influence. So I'm just wondering, why do they do that? And
why get a smaller sphere influence when you have a bigger one at the moment?
Yeah, exactly. It does not make sense, because if you would like to make America great again, then it would make sense to maintain as huge sphere of influence as possible. So if you are withdrawing from your sphere of influence to have just a smaller one, that does not mean making America great again.
All right, so I think these are excellent points from both of you. I think one thing I do want to think about then is, what does all this mean for Europe then, with a more uncertain U.S. In this equation? So let's look into this a little bit more. Trump has repeatedly threatened to withdraw the U.S. from NATO, of course. In response, and in trying to get the U.S. to stay, NATO member countries, especially in Europe, have pledged to increase their defense spending to at least 2% of their GDPs. It's a target they agreed to at the 2014 Wales Summit some 12 years ago. At the same time, European leaders, they have used various international forums to underscore the importance of maintaining strong transatlantic relations and strengthening Europe's defense industrial base as well. Take a look.
NATO is and will always be a transatlantic alliance. Part of keeping this alliance strong involves shifting responsibilities, moving away from unhealthy over-reliance on one ally to a fairer sharing of the responsibility for our collective security.
So, Marcin, this idea of Europe without America, it's definitely going to be a brave new world if it did come to play. Of course, this is never going to be black and white either-or situation, but maybe a gradual piecemeal shift. But then, again, for Europe, if that did come to pass, how is Europe preparing for it? How is Europe trying to unite and cohere around each other to build that support for each other?
2022, and specifically February 24th, 2022, was a rude awakening for Europeans. The onset of Russian full-scale invasion in Ukraine has entirely redefined European countries' understanding of our own security landscape within Europe. And then, of course, following the inauguration of Trump for the second term, the challenges have become even more pronounced. I do see that there is political will within the European Union to address these challenges. Of course, EU bureaucracy is famous for its labyrinthine qualities. Nevertheless, there are very concrete policies that are already being put in place. The European Union has defined its readiness roadmap by 2030. That includes, for example, creation of capability coalitions, also joint procurement. There are 3 flagship programs under the aegis of joint procurement initiatives. One of them is highly relevant to the conversations that we are having here in Taipei, Taiwan, and it is related to the enhancing drone warfare capabilities of European countries. There's also an active conversation about European air shield, because air capabilities are where Europeans still have some of the most pronounced dependencies on US military prowess, and also a European space shield. Then when it comes to actual tangible financial resources to make it a reality, we have the SAFE initiative that is committing over 150 billion euros of long maturity and competitively priced loans for member states to engage in urgent but also long-term defense procurement.
Right. I mean, okay, so sounds like this declaration of intent with the readiness roadmap by 2030. There's also some attempt to put the money where the mouth is in terms of the actual SAFE initiative and other items you mentioned earlier. How about your take, Simona? How do you see this? Do you see emerging opportunities for greater cohesion for EU going forward, and what are some potential challenges that may still need to overcome?
I think the most important is to take a look at how do the various citizens of various countries look at this problem. And I think, as Marcin said, this has underwent huge changes since 2022 when the full-scale invasion in Ukraine started. So since then, people in Europe started to understand that security should not be taken for granted. And I think it also helped a lot to see that maintaining a strong army is actually an important thing, because before that, especially when it comes to like Central and Eastern Europe, maybe being in an army would have a certain feeling of our previous history, because when we were not a democratic state yet, we would look down on the army, but now we see that we need them.
There was a cultural association between military and authoritarian polity, is it?
There was an association that the army was highly ineffective. It would be part of the state apparatus, which is actually repressive towards its own citizens. But this has changed, and now we see that army is necessary. We need them, and it starts to gain a better prestige. I would also think that there are like different approaches when it comes to involving various citizens, like having active reserves, maybe. And there is also probably a different approach when it comes to arms sales, because we still maintain, I mean, the Czech Republic maintains our own defense industry, and while we maintain it, there are definitely more subsidies or more potentials how to invest into that. Before the full-scale invasion, it would be maybe problematic because certain banks would have certain limitations how this industry can be subsidized, or if they would provide loans or not, and they would have a feeling that they would like to maintain peace, which means not financing anything having something in common with the arms. But now we see that it's important, and those like civil sector's limitations were changed.
All right. I mean, okay, that sounds like a promising change into how role of the military and security sector in general is shifting, conceptually almost, from association with repression now towards security, perhaps necessity, in a more positive light. So speaking of the importance of security, one thing we think about is, of course, and both of you mentioned this earlier before, of course, about Ukraine war 2022 being a major wake-up call, Russia being, of course, the main aggressor in that conflict. One thing we think about is, this kind of reminds me of what we used to learn about NATO. NATO, when it was created in 1949, its first Secretary General at the time, Lord Hastings, used to say that NATO was created to keep the Russians out, keep the Americans in, and keep the Germans down. Today we're talking, of course, if Americans are not as in as before, and Europe is trying to get up, can they still have the capacity to keep Russians out on their own? So question then for you, Martin, is how do you see Europe's capacity in the short term, especially in terms of ability to keep out Russian, be it conventional or perhaps more gray zone offensives against Europe?
Look, I have pointed to some of these very concrete policy mechanisms that are already in place within the European Union, and by just seeing the time horizon that we use to operationalize these policies, many of them are defined as with the time horizon by 2030. That's extremely fast in terms of European Union policymaking. Actually, these new resources are already being committed, even though we are now in a very politically sensitive period in terms of the European Union calendar, as Brussels is hotly debating the next multi-annual financial framework that will define the European Union's budget between 2028 to 2035. I know that you're asking about military capabilities. I'm focusing on bureaucracy, but in the EU, they are very closely intertwined. And I believe that these time horizons really point to the sense of urgency. Of course, there are many analyses that point to a dilapidated state of the Russian economy. There are many signs that Russia is weakened not only by the global sanctions regime and difficulties in procurement of most cutting-edge technologies, also through domestic cleavages. For example, recent intensification of crackdowns in the information space has demonstrated that there are some very rare in today's Russia forms of popular mobilization against restrictive policies that are coming from the Kremlin.
Simona, one question. Russia, of course, China being the other major authoritarian actor on the horizons. How do you see Europe is looking at China right now at a time when U.S.-Europe relation may be under a bit more strain, let's say? How do you see China might be in a position to exploit that potential rift?
I would say that there are more and more people in Europe, and especially in the European Union, who realize that China is our systemic rival. And it means that our systems are not compatible and are very different, and there are not many possibilities how to cooperate at anything, because even if we talk to each other, those differences are so big that that cannot be bridged. And there are even more people now who realize that, as our president said, China is the enabler of war, of Russian aggression towards Ukraine. And there's no point at cooperating with China and talking with China about peace between Russia and Ukraine when China is enabling this war. So one should be very careful when cooperating with China. And I think the politicians are slowly starting to realize that, and they are drafting policies which would address this problem. But at the same time, there are several governments within European Union, and maybe even the new Czech government now, who have a feeling that China might still be a good partner when it comes to economy, and we should engage more into economical cooperation with China, and maybe let China invest into our economies. But if we take a look at how did it go when China was investing or trying to invest into our economies, then it does not make any sense, because we see that there were many problems. The first one was that no investments actually came, especially when it came to the Czech Republic. It was merely acquisitions, and it actually did not create any job opportunities and so on. And it was like it was extremely low according to what China promised the first. The second problem, and it's even worse, that, as I said, it's a systemic rival. And because of this, we see that China does not maintain the rules of World Trade Organization, which means that they heavily subsidize into their economy. They try to weaponize everything, both import and export.
What I hear is that this recognition that China is, at the end of the day, a systemic rival. There might be occasional opportunity here and there, but ultimately it's not exactly a rule-abiding power, and Europeans all about respect for rules of the road, isn't it? All right, so I want to get into a next issue here, which is other major players in the Indo-Pacific. The world is changing. Of course, Ukraine and Iran war have brought renewed awareness of challenges to traditional and energy security, while evolving U.S.-China relations generates uncertainty. One natural response is to diversify dependence and to build new partnerships. One natural direction for Europe to look for new friends is the Indo-Pacific, where we are. The EU's foreign policy chief put it this way recently. Take a look.
Europe and the Indo-Pacific are at the pivotal moment. We are committed to free trade and open sea lanes. But both regions face challenges, from export controls to climate change and wars. The EU's broader partnership with the Indo-Pacific has three main pillars. First, security and defense. We have two key partnerships in the Indo-Pacific with South Korea and Japan, but we also work closely with many others.
All right, Martin, you spoke about this earlier as well, but can you just highlight for us what are some interesting, important new development here in terms of EU's greater engagement of Indo-Pacific partners?
Of course, speaking from a perspective of a Polish analyst, I would like to highlight the growing cooperation with South Korea, because particularly since, again, 2022, South Korea has become an extremely important provider of defense hardware to Europe, as many of our stocks were depleted through donations to Ukraine, where these technologies were needed immediately. So countries including Poland, but also Estonia, Finland, and Norway outside of the European Union are heavily procuring from the ROK. Some of these technologies include K2 Black Panther tanks, K9 Thunder howitzers, also in terms of air capacities, FA-50 aircraft, also Chunmoo rocket systems. And these are not merely procurements of final manufactured goods. South Korean defense companies are willing to work with European partners on deals that include technology transfers and MRO deals, so maintenance, repair, and operations in Europe. And countries like Poland are increasingly emerging as regional hubs for this type of cooperation.
I think one thing I take from it is that the cooperation now is going beyond diplomatic rhetoric now. That we're seeing more deeper industry level integration. We're seeing even enough trust for tech transfer, for example, between EU and some leading Indo-Pacific partners. Simona, one thing I want to ask you is, of course, we're doing this recording in Taiwan. So can you tell us about how Taiwan is part of this increasingly deepening web of relations between Europe and Indo-Pacific?
If I can demonstrate the connection between Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific,
yes, please.
We can take a look at, in the case of Taiwan, because now we see that Taiwan is actually engaged in what is happening in Europe when it comes to Russian invasion towards Ukraine. And there is a big cooperation, and this cooperation is usually triangular, because Ukraine might be afraid of cooperating with Taiwan directly. So it has certain ways how to circumvent the direct connections. Some of them goes through third countries, including Czechia. So there is a big cooperation among Czechia, Ukraine, and Taiwan when it comes to medical supplies, when it comes to like, hygienic stuff for the civilians, when it comes to civilian relief for the Ukrainians.
All right, thank you for that. And Marcin, on that note, that's about all the time we have today, but I'd like to thank you, of course, Simona, Marcin, both of you, for your comments and insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, that's our show. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Come check us out on YouTube, and until next time, it's good night from us from Taiwan.